If you would like to own a piece of the wilds yourself, visit ko-fi.com/Aquilo and click shop. Now sit back and enjoy the show. Aquilo. Special episode, The Wilds, Part 1. It happened the summer before she came back. A calm summer, if I remember well, and a prosperous one if I were to look back into the cafe's books. It was the summer of the wilds. Not that the wilds didn't happen every year. Like Christmas and Samhain, it rolls around like a spoke on the wheel, flashing before us with every turn. But until that summer, I had little knowledge or interest in the weekend festival destined for children. Annabelle had gone off for a few months, intent on finding herself, or whatever it is we young adults do with a backpack and a year's worth of savings. She'd heard tales of Chef Gagnon's offer and decided to make that happen for herself. I was sad to see her go. While I love the sage greens of the Aquilo, Annabelle took with her a little of the color from the place. Eric took her seat at the counter, but his lack of voracious curiosity made him a pale replacement. They were bittersweet times. On one hand, I'd resumed correspondence with Vicky Paramore. Nothing too intense. The strained exchanges of souls unsure what to say to one another. Every postcard a fresh introduction at a cocktail party, with small talk stumbling to find footing in real conversation. It's probably why we both leaned on such an antiquity as paper through the mail. The immediacy of email, or mother forbid, the phone, would have obliterated our delicate relationship. Like spun sugar cake topper, it would take little to crack or shatter the feelings that bound us. Then, on the other hand, there was Gulliver. Or rather, there wasn't. Not a visit or phone call or even a letter. I had to hear from a third party that he was in fine health, at least. Words of physical therapy and driving a different route for the season trickled into the Aquilo like coffee dripping into a pot. It would still be a while before I heard more from him, and that deluge would have an edge of its own. During that summer, though, not a day would pass without me hoping the shadow of a truck would darken the window of the cafe again. It was also, and perhaps most importantly, the summer I got rid of the macaron sprite. You see, there's a trait I'd been fumbling to cultivate in myself, a trait most desirable in others that I thought I lacked. Unlike a skill, a trait is one of those things you can't just grow. By its very nature, it's something that one is either born with or has nurtured for so long that it mutates who you are. The roots of a trait run deep, intertwined with the heart and the soul. Acting on a trait is second nature, but acquiring one is the next best thing to impossible. Anything else is forced. Behaviors that are planted in the shallow grounds of artifice and affectation, they're performed with intent and reflection, bent into habit over years until they suddenly aren't. And that's the tricky part. Watering an act for so long, giving it just enough sunlight that it flourishes into a trait. That's what I wanted back then. Specifically, I wanted to be able to see the beauty in broken things. I think we all have the seed of it inside. The way we gaze open-mouthed and awestruck at the ruins of cathedrals and monuments. We have the capacity to look beyond the cracked stones and crumbled columns and see the grandiose. But is it true beauty we see, or are we impressed by that dichotomy of the magnificent brought low? That is what I saw in the macaron sprite with the broken wing. But despite our tense relationship, that of jailer and jailed, I wanted to see more. I wanted to see what my brother Eric saw. "It's not ugly," Eric answered my musings. "It's just a little frayed. Aren't you, little buddy?" My brother had been tossing the leftover crumb of his chocolatine into the creature's cage, watching it jump and leap to catch them. The residual pain of a nasty bite had done a good job of teaching him to keep his fingers out from between the gilded bars, but his fascination with the sprite remained unfazed. The creature, though, had become restless in the last few months. The coming of spring fueled it with angry energy, making it more aggressive, doubling its escape attempts. It snarled at our conversation, bearing rows of needle-thin and shark-like teeth. The skin of the sprite, a bright purple, had a frog-like quality. Massive golden eyes and long knobby fingers made it look creepy from up close, though its features could be mistaken for adorable, not unlike a small rodent. Strange plant-like growths all over its skin lent it a grotesque appearance upon closer inspection. More than anything, it's the sprite's attitude that makes it ugly. Not since first encountering the creature have I seen it with a kind or gentle disposition. "Look beyond the big eyes and pretty colors," I explained. "That thing damn near ate a man." Now, Olivia interrupted, doing her best impression of a voice of reason. "There were dozens of those things nibbling at Orleans. That little guy could probably manage a finger, maybe a hand, but not a whole person." "You're not helping." The Aquilo was about to open. Already I could see the regulars pacing in front of the window, looking in at the 3 occupants, wondering if they should try the door. Most knew not to bother before official business hours, but some would give the handle a little pull as they wandered by. "Beauty is in the eye of the beholder," Olivia said, grunting as she pulled herself up from her knees. She'd been restocking the shelf where we keep our apple products. The stock had dwindled from fresh pies, my contribution, and jellies, to candies and vinegars. There would be fresh apples later that summer, but until then, Olivia had only but the non-perishables to sell. "And this beholder," Eric replied, "thinks this little guy is kinda cute." Olivia had a retort hanging on the tip of her lips, but the ache in her knees delayed her words long enough for a rapping to come at the door. The weather had been gentle through spring, and waiting outside, in the absence of rain, shouldn't be an issue for any of my regulars. The autumn months, especially with my prolonged sabbatical, had trained them to be patient with how I managed the opening hours of the Aquilo. No one wanted me to suffer another burnout, especially if that meant the supply of coffee and pastries would run dry. The customer service smile was already on my lips as I turned to wave off the customer. I was going to point at the imaginary watch on my wrist, like a mother would to remind a child that the time had still not come. It came as a surprise when I noticed Mayor Lagacé at the door, a closed fist and extended knuckle ready to knock a second time. To this day, the political branch of Aquilo's administration and the witches of the area maintain a tenuous alliance. Not that we haven't earned our scorn, but back then we were treated as a servant class, though I suppose none of us realized it yet. Still, when one of those hallowed warriors of Aquilo insists on an audience, who are we to argue? "Cover that thing," Lagacé insisted upon entering the Aquilo. She meant the macaron sprite, and she had a point. Playing with it in plain sight on the cafe counter was the kind of cavalier attitude that would get one in trouble around here. Still, the cold edge of her demand felt out of character. Despite a penchant for being brusque and to the point, Lagacé was a stickler for pleasantries. No matter the issue, she would perform every song and dance demanded by proper decorum. On that morning, there was no time for the pageantry. "Please," I said, thick with sarcasm. "Come in." She did. She walked right up to the counter, and without permission or even a polite query, Mayor Lagacé grabbed the cover and threw it over the cage. Needless to say, I was offended. Aquilo, the Canadian side, may be her democratically appointed domain, but the cafe is my fiefdom. "No one could see the sprite from outside," I reassured her, weak words upon deaf ears. "I did," she stated, more annoyed than angry. "Don't you know what time of year it is?" Looking up to the ceiling, I conjured a calendar in my mind's eye. I could remember, almost a month ago, the mayors had flipped their coin and the passage of the spring equinox had been thus marked. As much as I could tell, this far down Aquilow's table, the customary culling of the Hellgate had gone well. Neither of the mayors had returned with missing limbs or bandaged flesh. Though the psychological scars would be long in revealing themselves, I still counted this as a win. I went through the rest of the catalog of potentially important supernatural or folkloric dates before shrugging my shoulders. "It's spring," I said, dismissive in my declaration. "We are 1 week away from the wilds," Mayor Lagacé said. I remember how serious she looked, her eyes locked onto mine as if this revelation held some secret weight between the two of us. The wilds, however, didn't mean that much to me at the time. I'd only heard about it here and there from the few children I interact with, or from Annabelle, who might as well have been a child when discussing the matter. Never had the wilds been given any more gravitas than what it was. Summer camp for kids. Judging by Mayor Lagacé's look, we might as well have been discussing nuclear Armageddon. "Veronique," Olivia said, using a tone of hers that's both diplomatic yet uncompromising. "What does the wilds have to do with Miriam's sprite?" The mayor took a seat at the counter, next to Eric. I could measure in teaspoons the number of times either Mayor Byrne or Lagacé had sat anywhere else but their own private table when visiting the Aquilo. This must have been serious indeed, I thought. "I would hope," she said, "that both matters remain unrelated. But the wilds are already problematic this year, and I don't want the local imagination burning too hot because they saw a fairy at the Aquilo, especially if we have to cancel the wilds." Olivia made a show of raising her eyebrows, surprise bordering on outrage hung over her features like curtains thick enough to block out the sun. "Cancel the wilds?" she asked, as if she were wondering about postponing sunrise or switching off the moon. "Are you out of your mind, Veronique? You might as well suggest canceling Christmas and Easter." "Isn't that just summer camp?" I interject, trying to make sense of the outrage. Just a summer camp? Olivia and Lagacé asked in unison. "The wilds isn't just a weekend in the woods, Miriam," Mayor Lagacé explained, reining in her frustration. "It's a rite of passage," Olivia explained. "A fond memory most Aquilo residents share," Lagacé added. "It's a seminal experience," Olivia concluded. "The common root binding us all as a community. You can't cancel the wilds. They'll be rioting in your streets." Veronique Lagacé, mayor of the Canadian half of Aquilo, tapped the counter, quietly signaling her need for coffee. "I'm not hoping to cancel the wilds, Ms. Fig," she explained, staring down Olivia as few in Aquilo would dare. "But that isn't up to me. It's up to her." I can still remember the scalding of hot steam burning my hand, the coffee machine taking advantage of my distraction. "Me?" I asked, after letting the pain subside a little. "Why me?" "Because," she goes on, taking the hot paper mug from my hand, "that idiot Augustin decided to hold the wilds over on the Pickering farm, right next to the woods. Where your Hellgate is," I concluded. "But didn't you just close that thing? Shouldn't everything be safe? Besides, I have other food on my plate, namely how to get rid of this thing." I tapped the fabric covering the gilded cage. The sprite was quick to take a swipe at my finger. If I wasn't offering a piece of fruit or some bits of pastries, the little creature had nothing but disdain for me in its predicament. "Rid of it?" Lagacé asked. "Humanely," I added, preemptively cutting off whatever draconian measure the mayor had in mind. "Reintroduce it into its natural environment, whatever that is." And that was the crux of the problem. None of my peers had any more experience with fairies, sprites, or brownies than I had. We didn't know where the macaron sprite had come from, or where it belonged. "It's settled, then," the mayor said, prematurely satisfied. "You're going to need an expert, someone who knows more about these creatures than I, or anyone else in Aquilo." Lagacé took a sip of coffee, wincing as she burned her tongue. There was a knowing confidence in her eye. Nowadays, I might argue with Mère Lagacé and challenge her authority with a firmer hand. Back then, the woman still scared the hell out of me. Fine, I conceded. I'll do it, whatever it is. Who do I need to speak to get rid of this thing? Veronique took another sip, though more careful this time, giving a sideways glance to the door as it opened. A gentle gust of fresh air slipped in to challenge the warm coffee and butter of the Aquilo. With it came the smell of moist hay and dry dust, a familiar combination. Someone with the knack, Lagacé explained, smiling into her mug. And she has got the knack. The bird flew in first, a streak of color spanning the gamut of the rainbow gliding just below the ceiling. It drew a long circle, weaving between the light fixtures. All eyes were drawn to the majestic parrot, the prism of its feathers and graceful trajectory a spectacle all its own. By the time it landed on the counter, inches from Eric, the owner had walked into the cafe and sauntered up to the register. "Hello," she whispered, her voice as quiet as her pet's colors were loud. "Giselle?" Clad in grays and tans, she nearly vanished into the coffee and cream of the Aquilo's decor. A performer from Ariella's Infinite Carousel, I felt compelled to look behind and around her, hoping and fearing that I would see the master of ceremony herself, despite the bright morning sky warming the dining room tiles. But the circus wasn't in town, and there was no trace of its ringleader. In fact, sitting atop Giselle's head was Ariella's little tattered top hat. "The one and only." She gave a stage bow, dipping low, hat in hand. "What are you doing in Aquilo?" The teen took her time answering, walking instead to the stool next to Eric's. She hopped on, and her bird jumped onto her shoulder. "Dad needs my help for work," she explained, pulling a dried date from her breast pocket. "And I hear you have a little problem I could help with." Without asking, without checking, Giselle reached to the covered cage, pulling it to her. The muscles in my arms tensed, ready to intervene should the girl do anything foolish. And wouldn't you know it, she did. "Oh," she gasped, twisting the latch on the brass cage. "Would you look at you?" Rainbow, her parrot, twisted his neck to the side to get a better look, cawing loudly in warning. "Fish!" the bird screamed and whistled. "Hush you," Giselle whispered, putting her hand through the cage door. "Careful," Olivia, Eric, and I warned in unison. But the lanky circus performer didn't flinch. She pulled her hand out, not holding the macaron sprite, but rather letting it perch freely atop her finger. Having been trapped in the cage for nigh onto a year, the sprite wasn't long in attempting its escape. Fluttering wings were insufficient for it to fly, and Giselle was quick to catch the creature before it hit the countertop. After that, it made no further attempt, content to curl around her fingers instead. She kept playing with it, pulling the sprite's wings open to inspect its wound, poking at its belly, and flipping it this way and that to get a good look. Like a veterinarian giving a checkup to a vicious dog, she maneuvered the cranky creature with the deft care of an expert. Not once in her ministrations did she get bit, or did the macaron sprite even attempt to take a chunk out of her. Lagacé was right. She had the knack. "Where did you get it?" Giselle asked, putting the sprite back into the cage. There was no protest from my prisoner. "He just appeared one day in the pastry display, conjuring macaron after macaron. Then there were 2 of him, then 3, then an infestation." While curious to know more of the macaron sprite's origins, it was the prospect of unburdening myself of the thing that appealed. "So," Giselle said, delighted by her encounter, "looking to get rid of it?" I nodded. Giselle gave her bird another dried piece of fruit before broadening her smile. She tucked a strand of mousy brown hair behind her ear and adjusted her hat in the process. "Then I'll see you at the Wilds, camp counselor." Never have I ever felt more unqualified for a job. Even when first taking over the Ache Willow, while lacking experience in running a business and shouldering all the work for a cafe, I could still lean on my cooking skills and short stint as a barista. Camp counselor was a new concept to me, like a foreign language I'd barely ever heard spoken. I would have been better equipped to attempt neurosurgery than be responsible for the welfare of a dozen kids. The bag I had packed for the weekend felt light on my shoulder. Olivia had coached me on what to bring, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd forgotten something. Walking through the fields of the Pickering farm, I could already see colorful tents near the forest. Mayor Lagacé wasn't kidding. Whoever had chosen to set up the wilds couldn't have picked a closer spot to the Hellgate. If I concentrated enough, I bet I could have picked up the scent of burnt flesh in the air, a bloody reminder of my encounters with demons and death in the very shadow of these woods. Demons and ghosts and murder and death, all threats very real to Ache Willow and very close to my destination. Still, it was the little shapes running back and forth in the distance that sent a shiver up my spine. Their energy was preternatural in abundance, and their purposes shifting and capricious. They could, in my experience, not be reasoned with. Their appetites were voracious, and they required little rest in between bouts of mischief. My kingdom for a hunger demon to fight, I mumbled to myself. Children. I can handle a child. A child I can share conversation with. One can decipher a child's intent, navigate its whims, and negotiate its intentions. Like a swarm to a bee, children become fickle and dangerous in groups. Their fear and respect of adults vanish like so much salt in soup. And there, at the edge of the woods, a dozen of them waited for me. Shifting with the effort, or slowing down to enjoy one more second of solitude, I switched the macaron sprite's cage from one hand to the other, while doing the same for my bag. I took comfort for a moment that I wouldn't be the only one responsible for this gaggle. Augustin, the master of ceremonies behind the wilds, was of course going to be there, as was Giselle. If she could tame a parrot and a vicious pastry fairy, she could perhaps handle the kids. There was also supposed to be another camp counselor, hopefully one with enough experience for both of us. I walked between the tents, a deliberate smile pulled tight over my features. Miriam and Miss Dufour rang across the small camp. Familiar faces I'd seen scowling or bored next to their parents, looked up at me, dancing around in celebration. I struggled to put a name to each smile, changing Bill's son to Emile and the O'Connor girl to Irene in the ledger of my mind. One boy in particular, a chunky lad with square shoulders who'd surely grow up to be an athlete, managed to dull the sourness from me, if only a little. All with one simple statement. "Aw, man," he said, laying his eyes on me. "We are eating good this year." From that moment on, the introductions went a lot smoother. While being swarmed with expectant children remained a burden, it was reassuring to know that I had a role to play, something to do aside from keeping an eye out for demons. Children are fickle, however, and it wasn't long before the novelty of me wore off. Eyes turned up to look at me were soon pulled towards the sky. A spark of color cut through the afternoon, attracting gasps and pointing fingers in its direction. Rainbow the parrot circled the whole camp, spiraling down before he came to rest on Giselle's shoulder. With fresh chum tossed in the water, the shoal of fish that swarmed me shifted their attention to the new meat. Giselle may not have looked any more comfortable with the spotlight than I did, but she had more experience with it. Being able to show off Rainbow and do a few tricks, she winked at me before trailing the screaming children away. A pied bird in lieu of a piper, leading them farther afield. All but one. "You brought your fairy?" Little Nisha had made it to summer. I wish I could say she'd done so none the worse for wear, but the cancer had made noticeable progress. She hadn't endured so much as survived until the wilds. "Sure did," I explained, lowering myself to sit on the ball of my feet. "I'm going to release it back into the forest." Nisha's skin had taken on the colorless hues of ashes. Her cheeks, once round and plump, had sunken. The disease, or perhaps the treatment, was eating her from inside. Despite it all, the spark in her eyes hadn't dimmed. She pulled at the cloth of the cage with the elated curiosity a child her age was entitled to, and she would not be denied. "Careful," I warned. "It bites." She raised the cloth as she raised her eyes. Her lack of care for her fingertips spoke the same question as her gaze. What does safety offer one such as I? "It looks scared," Nisha worried after a brief inspection of the creature. I was about to reassure her that the sprite wasn't used to the outdoors, not after spending a year recovering in my apartment, but I was interrupted in a rude but familiar way. "That's because it is," a grating voice cut between the tents. "Miss Dufour brought a city mouse to the country, and we all know how that story goes." "Ophelia," I said, standing as to not have her look down on me, "what are you doing here?" But I knew. The second I heard her voice, I knew. "Mayor Byrne asked me to, and someone has to protect the children," she answered, putting her slender fingers on Nisha's shoulder. "Of course. Aquilo has 2 mayors, one for the Canadian side of the border and one for the U.S. side. Inseparable, they manage the town's affairs while keeping their more unusual responsibilities from the public. I should have known that if Veronique Lagacé came to me alone, then Marie Belle Byrne was off seeing someone else." "I suppose Mayor Lagacé asked the same of you?" Ophelia asked rhetorically. "And you do that by bringing a dangerous creature with you. Odd choice." I wish I could tell the story differently, that I had come back with a perfectly crafted one-liner that put Ophelia in her place once and for all. But I wasn't a liar then, and I'm not one now. Barely did I open my mouth to speak that Nisha interrupted. "If you two are going to fight," she huffed, "then I'm going to go see the parrot." With some effort, the little girl took the cage from me with both hands and started hauling it along with her. So armored with intent she was in the process that I almost allowed her to run off unchallenged. "Nisha, you can't take that with you. It's dangerous." I took a step in her direction, ready to take back the cage. I could see Ophelia from the corner of my eye, nodding in rare approval of my actions. "Miss Dufour," the girl said, turning around, her back bent to keep the cage off the ground. "This is the wilds. Danger is part of the fun." She puffed her chest out, both to take in a deep breath and as a show of pride. I could read in playful script on her camp t-shirt, "I survived the wilds." Hopefully, that would be true of all of them. I busied myself the best I could in the only way I know how, making a feast. Now, a Michelin star situation this was not. I'd been given a list of what would be available both as food and equipment, and the pickings were slim. Of course, the kids would want to eat things cooked over a campfire, which is a romantic notion until one stops to think of what can be baked, roasted, or fried in such a fashion. I had sausages and hamburger meat in a cooler waiting, along with some bread and a vast collection of canned veggies. Pots, pans, and other equipment were stacked neatly and efficiently in a plastic bin, along with a large collection of metal skewers, presumably to make hot dogs. In my bag, I brought a few things of my own to bolster the struggling selection. Spices, of course, but also flour, quick-rise yeast, and a few other essentials to bake some damper bread. The plan was to teach the kids the recipe and have them participate. "What are you doing?" the red-headed boy named Gabriel asked. He'd been loitering around the cooking area for a while now, like a bee teased by a flower, approaching then flying away, too skittish to alight on a petal. "Well," I explained, glad for the audience, "I'm mixing in some eggs and chili powder in this meat so the meat is gross," another child, a slight little blonde thing called Eloise, complained. They were starting to abandon their games, pulled to the campfire by pangs of hunger. From the way they eyed the coolers and hamburger buns, I could tell time was short if I was to avoid a riot. "That's okay," I said, pointing to a massive bowl of mashed chickpeas. "I'm also making falafel as an alternative." Falafels are gross, Gabriel said, repeating his opinion. No, they're not, another child in the back countered, as if they were personally attacked. I like meat. When do we eat? Can we have ice cream while we wait? The questions and complaints came as a rising cacophony, drowning the sounds of squishing meat and sizzling oil. It was difficult to remain focused on the task. All the while, I could see through the twilight Ophelia spying my failure with a satisfied grin on her lips. In the end, dinner was a failure. Not to the children's standards, of course. Sure, the chaos bred more complaints, and more than one child voiced their dissatisfaction with my Thai and basil beef patties, but all of that was quickly forgotten through the power of brownies and cocoa. Sitting around our first campfire of the weekend, I licked my wounds by watching Ophelia suffer her own failure. Like a fisherman, she tossed a line in the hopes of catching fish. Hers were lines of yarn, and her hooks were made for crochet. The bait were those small stuffed animals she made and sold at her shop. Her prey, however, had no interest in the colorful menagerie. Fresh summer air, sugar, the flickering of flames, and unprecedented freedom served as an inebriant for the children. They ran around, screaming and laughing, flirting with disaster with every trip and fall. Augustin had his hands full supervising the group, and I suppose Ophelia and I should have been helping, but neither of us had the necessary skills. That left one person, but she wasn't an adult, and I had yet to understand her role in this whole endeavor. I liked the food. Giselle sat beside me, Rainbow perched on her shoulder. You don't have to lie. My ego isn't so fragile. Not quite a lie of my own, but perhaps a bending of the truth. Though not as delicate as before, my self-esteem was nowhere near the bedrock it is today. Giselle remained quiet for a moment, happy to draw her knees up to her chin and cast a shy smile into the fire. I don't lie, she said, content but unyielding. Her eyes, alight with the flames before us, were drawn to the edge of the woods. She'd moisten her lips every so often, her smile renewed with every passing of her tongue. Dexterous as you'd expect a circus performer to be, she used her foot to lift the sheet from the cage. Doubling over, she tilted her head to get a better look, or rather to make sure that the sprite, huddled in its brass prison, had a good view of the tree line. The sight of the creature brought a sweetness to her. The connection she shared with Rainbow, but seemed to struggle building with people, was obvious between her and the sprite. Lagacé was right. She had the knack, whatever that was. The sprite walked up to the bars, wrapping its long, knobby fingers around them. Careful not to touch the metal, it leaned forward, wings unfurled to better taste the wind. Minutes passed, the sprite tasting the hope of freedom, and Giselle in turn savoring that anticipation. Loneliness would be the theme of the weekend for me, I could tell. Everyone had something to do, some role to accomplish. Everyone but Ophelia and me, but I'd rather hang out by the Hell Gate and make friends with the demons than offer her another olive branch. At least I'd be getting rid of the macaron sprite, able to sleep easy on how that was accomplished. Soon, Giselle whispered to the creature. We'll be home soon. Sleep was a nightmare. Not the kind brought on by a bitter Morpheus, but rather the kind inspired by physical discomfort. My tent was a foreign environment. The floor, which I had thought hard and unyielding, was peppered with stones and pebbles that dug into the skin. The sleeping bag was too warm, but sleeping without was too cold. No Goldilocks middle to be found. Then there were the sounds and sights. Twice, perhaps 3 times, I was awoken by the screams of children, cries that would quickly melt into giggles. The lights were a little harder to dismiss, casting themselves against the washed-out red of my nylon tent. There, they created ethereal shadow plays that were at once obviously from flashlights, but also occasionally more. Once, I even crawled out of my overheating bed to scold the children back to their tents, but was cut short by Augustin's voice, who I suspect was already administering discipline. All that to say, I found no rest. The only satisfaction greeting me on the cloudy morning that followed was to see Ophelia as disheveled as I was. Staring at each other from across the camp, the thread of unfinished business hung tight between us. Better get breakfast going. My old teacher would have said something along the lines of simple food for simple minds upon seeing the children's excitement. Breakfast was not a fancy affair that morning. Toast, eggs, bacon, and orange juice. But the secret is in the ingredients. Thick Belgian loaf over embers with eggs cooked in bacon grease. I got the kids involved by having them squeeze their own oranges. There was also some oatmeal with cranberries and fresh blueberries for those who preferred. The children ate, and I savored my success, tasting the jealousy on Ophelia's expression. "Did you see the lights?" Gabriel asked his friends around him. At that point, I still thought that he was the most likely perpetrator of mischief, and he could still have been the culprit, taunting the other kids into playing his game. The feasting masses shook their heads. "I saw them," I said, smiling behind my coffee mug. "I stayed awake for them," Gabriel explained. "I heard my sister say there's always lights on the first night and shadows on the second." Ears were teased all the more by the vague promise. Every child sitting around the vestiges of the campfire leaned in, ready to hear more. "What shadows?" Ophelia asked, her voice hoarse from lack of use. She'd been quiet all morning, watching me cook, but with her eyes constantly pulled towards the tree line. "I don't know," Gabriel admitted. "Old kids don't talk about the wilds." "It ruins the surprise," Irene added. I have to confess that Ophelia and I exchanged a brief, guilty look of concern. Surprise? We hadn't been told about any surprise. Judging from her look, Ophelia knew as little as I did. The children seemed delighted at the idea. I was apprehensive. After all, wasn't that exactly what I'd been asked to do? Breakfast proceeded, soon followed by cleaning up. Few of the children dared protest helping out. I offered for Nisha to rest instead, but she insisted on doing her part. Brave kid. Just as the last bag of recycling was tied and the last piece of cutlery cleaned, the camp's attention was drawn by a familiar voice. "Fish!" Rainbow called out from the sky above. The parrot circled around camp, drawing a large spiral between the tents before alighting on Giselle's shoulder. She, in turn, wove quietly between the tents, then the children, seemingly unaware of the attention she attracted. A complacent smile on her face, she'd let her hands wander, patting the head of a girl here, ruffling the hair of a boy there, making her way to the campfire. The sky cleared a little, letting a beam of morning sun paint the ground around us for a moment. Caught in the light, Giselle appeared clad in motley attire, despite her typical gray clothes. The effect was ephemeral and could have passed for an illusion. Maybe it was. "I saved you a little something to eat," I called out as a greeting. Nothing says good morning like fresh breakfast. "And I," she said, scratching under Rainbow's chin to his delight, "found a place for your little friend. But he'll have to come later if that's okay." Her attention was on Augustin, her father. She watched him as he went through a checklist of things to do on a clipboard. The expression on her face wasn't unlike the one she wore while watching the tree line the previous night. It was difficult to reconcile that the odd little man who sold butterfly wings to gullible tourists was actually Giselle's father. The fact seemed to surprise him, too, every time he lay his eyes on her. With effort, she perked up and put on a smile again. She did a slow pirouette to get a look at the assembled children and attract their attention. "Who wants to go pick grass and ferns?" she asked with a delighted grin. The kids didn't reciprocate. Grass and ferns? Why would anyone be interested in that? Only little Nisha, ever hungry to consume every last crumb that life would allow her, perked up at the question. But Giselle wasn't done. "So we can make some skyfish." The children erupted in cheers, some grabbing partners to dance around in clumsy kicks and steps. Whatever these skyfish were, they had a hold on the kids of Aquilo that I'd never seen anywhere else. Like prom to high school students, this craft project was a big deal. And I still had no idea what they were. The dozen kids were split between Ophelia, Augustin, and me. It seemed logical that Giselle wouldn't be put in charge of any of the children, being a teenager herself. Not that I'd never seen camp counselors her age. I had friends who'd done it, but it was always in more controlled environments. The jobs were on properties dedicated to summer camps. They were owned by companies that offered resources and support. Teenagers weren't a liability, they were cheap labor. The Wilds is a beast of a different nature. It's local, family-operated, and the sort of weird and wonderful that makes it utterly Aquilo. Besides, Giselle seemed to have her own affairs to attend to. The children tied their boots and hiking shoes and picked up their bags and put on their most determined expressions. They weren't just off to pick up interesting leaves and peculiar-looking branches. They were going on a grand adventure. Ophelia, to her credit, did seem to get into the spirit of things. I could hear her ask her kids what kind of plants they were hoping to find and where they thought their search should start. For my part, I didn't have to do a thing. Gabriel and Nisha had been assigned to my group, and between the former's assertive, if loud, nature and Nisha's unstoppable determination, all I had left to do was float down their current. "So," I asked, timid from ignorance, "what is a skyfish?" We'd crossed the threshold between forest and fields, stepping over the shallow ditch that separated one from the other. The veiled sun would soon vanish between the branches, swallowed by a canopy of oak, maple, and evergreens. We'd be entering another world, one that I knew to be as dangerous as it could be marvelous. Gabriel and Nisha shared a look, then turned their attention to Caroline and Andrew, my other charges. In unison, they all shrugged. "You don't know?" "We know," Nisha assured. "We just don't know, you know?" I had more questions, but they would have to wait. Caroline had found a dead tree trunk with some mushrooms growing on it. Northern tooth mushroom, I later learned they were called. Not dangerous, but not commonly edible either. The fungus wasn't what held her attention, though. Instead, it was the patch of lush beech fern that grew all around the fallen tree that got them excited. I did my job, looking around to make sure they weren't eating anything they shouldn't, or that there were no ditches or rocks for them to trip over and harm themselves with. And, of course, I kept my senses sharp, listening and watching for stirrings of a less mundane nature. So the morning went, walking from one patch of ferns to the other. The kids grabbed leaves and grass like I might pick up ingredients at the farmer's market, filling their bags to the brim in the process. Nisha did her best to keep up, but as the day wore on, there were more and more moments where she'd let Gabriel, Caroline, and Andrew run off ahead. Occasionally, we'd hear the cries of excitement from other groups of kids. Gabriel would demand we check out what they found, but for the most part, we kept to our own path, accompanied by the various sounds of the forest. Until we weren't. The silence fell like a gust of wind, blowing through the branches and leaves to erase every cracking of wood, scamper of critter, and song of bird. Gabriel was the last to stop talking, leaving behind a quiet as thick as fog. We weren't supposed to be here. I could have sworn that I'd navigated us far away from this place, specifically to avoid stumbling onto it by mistake. The forest had decided otherwise. Or maybe my subconscious did. Either way, here we were, a stone's throw from the Hell Gate, the Thorn Door, the place where demons used to enter the world. "Guys," I asked, voice failing to remain firm, "are you okay waiting here?" The kids traded looks to quietly consult one another. I could see Nisha shaking her head slowly, and Caroline look around in an effort to find the answer amongst the trees. Gabriel reached out to take Nisha's hand, then put on the bravest face a 9-year-old could fake, and nodded. "Just stay here. I won't be a minute." The cracking of branches and snapping of twigs underfoot accompanied me the few dozen meters until I got to the clearing. I expected the lingering smell of burning flesh to be there still. Instead, it was the moist aroma of sod and fungus that welcomed me. That, and my fellow camp counselor. She didn't hear me coming, not at first. Dressed in pants too short for a venture through the woods and covered in a loose-knit sweater already littered in snagged leaves, Ophelia busied her nimble fingers on the thorn gate. Like spider's legs weaving a web, her fingers danced about the complex structure, pulling the thin branches from their woven pattern. Frustrated, angry, Ophelia was unknotting the frame of the hellgate, inch by inch. "Where are your kids?" I asked, shattering the silence. Her head whipped up so fast I thought her neck would snap. Eyes round and wet like melon balls, she looked up at me without a word, struggling to reconcile my presence with our location. "And what do you think you're doing?" "I left my kids in a clearing nearby," she said, "so I could come here and try to tear down what you've done." It was my turn to be surprised. Back then, I didn't know all I know now. "What I've done? This thing's been here long before I knew Aquilo even existed." Her work continued despite the interruption. There was a desperate energy to her efforts, an urgency that felt almost contagious. My own fingers itched to go over and start unraveling the thorns with her. "You, your ancestors, whatever." "No, not whatever. I had nothing to do with this. I've been dealing with the things that come out of that gate for years now. And if you ask me, that kind of knitting seems far more up your alley than mine." Her features darkened at the accusation. There were bones and stones and other items woven into the pattern of the hellgate. Nonsensical and occasionally macabre trinkets that were part of the structure and probably part of the magic. Ophelia's eyes scanned through them, looking for something. A clever barb, perhaps, or maybe just the strength to go on with her work. "If this was my magic," she said, stepping back, "I'd know how to get it undone." The moment her fingers, red and raw from the effort, let go of the branches, the loose threads of the thorn gate began to knit themselves back together. Before I could even blink, the damage Ophelia had inflicted was undone, the ominous door in the woods intact. "I tried cutting it, burning it, I even poured bleach on the roots. Nothing. It's as stubborn as you are." I'd wondered about destroying the hellgate on a few occasions myself. I wouldn't have played with fire, what with it being in the middle of the woods and all, but uprooting the whole thing or cutting it down had crossed my mind. I assumed that if such a thing were possible, the mayors of Aquilo would have done so already. "You keep saying it yourself." I sounded far less angry than I felt. "I'm not that good of a witch. I wouldn't even know where to start to make something like this." Lovingly, Ophelia reached out to touch one of the bones, a long one, almost the length of her arm. From some forest animal, I thought, as unfortunate as the bird who'd left a skull a few inches away. "Not you," she said, also tamer than usual, "but a Dufour." I, in turn, put my fingers on the structure of the gate. Had I ever touched the thing before? The texture of the knitting wasn't cool under my fingers as I expected, but it wasn't warm either. It felt the same temperature as my body, giving it an unsettling animal quality. "We cook, Ophelia. Cakes and pies and stews and soups. Things that heal the soul and soothe the mind. It's you that knits and crochets, and that thing looks like it was knit." I scratched at the surface of a branch, scraping off the thin bark that covered it like so much skin. It didn't grow back. "This is what makes you dangerous, Miriam. You're satisfied and uncurious." By that point, I was numb to her insults. She'd been needling at me like this for over a year. One out of every 2 sentences a barb or a jab. Only when particularly relevant did they manage to scratch my own skin. I was in the process of formulating my own clever response, rolling the words in my mouth into something venomous to spit back. But then came the giggle, the laughter, and finally, the scream. "Gabriel?" We ran. Accusations and recriminations would come later, but in that one moment we were of one mind, though we went our separate ways. Ophelia sprinted to her own kids. I knew the scream had been from Gabriel, one of the children under my care, but I understood her worries. If anything happened to my charge, it could happen to hers. I didn't try to stop her. What had been a 5-minute journey getting to the Hellgate was now an hour-long sprint getting back. Branches and pine needles scratched at my face, my ankles twisting to keep me upright and running, all with the single purpose of making it back in time. But the kids were gone. I must have known even before I got there. There was a fleeting moment when I thought I'd gotten lost. This was a different clearing. After all, don't all trees look alike? I knew, though. I knew because that's the sort of poetic comeuppance that the neglectful suffer. I'd left my charges unsupervised to indulge my curiosity and then my spite. This was my punishment. I also knew because the children had left something behind. Lying abandoned next to a few wild mushrooms, bright and yellow as a dandelion, I found Citron, Nisha's plush toy canary. Aquilo is written by J.F. Dubow and narrated and produced by me, Amy Frost. If you enjoyed this podcast and would like to hear more, please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts or your preferred podcast platform. Want to support the show? Buy us a coffee. Go to ko-fi.com/Aquilo to donate. Aquilo has a Patreon. Visit patreon.com/Aquilo for details. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram under the username Aquilo.